This is not a love story, it's an obsession that plunged a kingdom into madness. When the queen's husband died, she refused to bury him. For 3 years, she dragged his coffin across the country. Every single night, she would command the lid be opened so she could whisper secrets to his decaying body, and kiss what was left of his lips. This story of devotion and decay will make you question the line between love and insanity. On the 1st of November, 1506, as an icy wind swept across the Castilian plain, the funeral procession came to a halt. The queen emerged from the carriage, her figure a slender, dark silhouette against the moonless night. She commanded that the lead-lined coffin be opened. In the flickering torchlight, the face of her late husband appeared waxen and serene. She leaned down, her long hair brushing against his cold cheek. She did not weep. She merely gazed, as if expecting him to open his eyes at any moment and chide her for disturbing his slumber. The biting wind whipped at the cloaks of the courtiers, their faces etched with a mixture of pity and impatience. For weeks, they had been on this macabre journey, a slow, meandering pilgrimage with a corpse. They had become creatures of the dark, their days spent in shuttered rooms of provincial monasteries, their nights a somber parade through the desolate heart of Castile. The queen insisted upon it, claiming the sun was too harsh for Philip's delicate, sleeping features. Juana traced the line of her husband's jaw, a gesture once filled with possessive love, now a ghostly echo of a life that had been so vibrant, so infuriatingly alluring. She remembered the fire in his eyes, the curve of his lips when he smiled, a smile that had promised kingdoms and delivered betrayals. Yet, even in death, he held her captive. Her love for him was a physical ache, a constant, gnawing emptiness that the sight of his still form could paradoxically soothe and intensify. A cough from one of the guards broke the silence. He shifted his weight, his armor clinking in the frigid air. The queen did not so much as flinch. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of this coffin, to the silent men who lay within. She had become deaf to the whispers of her council, blind to the needs of her kingdom. There was only Philip, and the unending journey to lay him to rest in Granada, a final wish she clung to with the ferocity of a drowning woman. She ran a gloved finger over his lips, half expecting to feel the warmth of his breath. The illusion was so powerful, so seductive, that for a fleeting moment, she could almost believe this was all a cruel jest. That he would awaken, his laughter booming in the silent night, and pull her into his arms. But the cold, unyielding reality of his stillness always brought her back to the crushing weight of her grief. He was gone, and she was alone, adrift in a sea of sorrow. The bishop, his face a mask of weary concern, stepped forward from the small crowd of dignitaries. He cleared his throat gently, the sound barely audible above the wind. He spoke of the hour, of the need for the living to find shelter from the numbing cold. He implored her to consider their progress, to allow the procession to continue its journey toward the next village before the dawn broke upon them. His words were reasonable, kind, and utterly meaningless to her. Juana's gaze remained fixed on Philip's face, as if she had not heard the cleric at all. She saw a flicker of annoyance in her memory of her husband's expression, the way his brow would furrow when his pleasures were interrupted by matters of state or church. She almost smiled. In her mind, she and Philip were united against this intrusion, a silent pact between the living and the dead. The bishop was an outsider to their singular, eternal communion. Without turning her head, she raised a single, pale hand, a gesture of absolute and final authority. The bishop fell silent, bowing his head in submission. He knew, as they all did, that her grief had forged itself into a will of iron. To argue was not only futile but dangerous. She was the queen, and this was her vigil. Her command was the only law that mattered on this desolate, windswept plain, under the cold and unforgiving stars of a Castilian autumn. Her attention returned to the coffin's occupant. She began to speak to him in a low whisper, her words stolen by the wind before they could reach another's ears. She recounted the day's trivialities, the weariness of the horses, the sullen faces of her ladies-in-waiting. It was a habit she had formed in the first days of her widowhood, a way to maintain the illusion of their shared life, to pretend that his silence was merely a thoughtful pause in an ongoing conversation. She remembered their last argument, a bitter, jealous row that had left her weeping and him storming from her chambers. The memory was a sharp stone in her heart. Had he forgiven her? Did he know, in his final moments, the depth of her adoration, a love so vast it had often resembled madness? She rearranged a fold of the velvet shroud that lined his coffin, a small, tender act of penance for 1,000 imagined sins against him. The torchlight cast shadows that danced across his features, giving the illusion of movement. For an instant, she thought she saw his eyelid twitch. Her breath caught in her throat, a surge of impossible hope flooding her veins. But it was only a trick of the light, a cruel mockery of her deepest desire. The stillness returned, more profound and absolute than before. The hope receded, leaving behind an even deeper layer of despair. He was not sleeping. He was gone. Yet she could not accept it. To accept his death would be to accept the end of her own world. He had been her sun, her universe. Without him, she was merely a lost planet, spinning in the cold, dark void. This journey, this macabre parade, was her desperate attempt to keep his light from extinguishing completely. As long as he was with her, even in this state, a part of him, and therefore a part of her, remained alive and intact. Finally, she straightened up, her back stiff with cold and sorrow. She gave the order to close the coffin. The heavy lid was lowered, and the sound of the latches being secured echoed with a dreadful finality in the night air. Each click was a nail in the coffin of her own heart. She watched as the pallbearers hoisted their precious burden back onto the ornate, black-draped carriage, their movements slow and reverent under her watchful eye. The procession moved on, a river of shadows flowing through the sleeping countryside. Juana did not return to her own carriage. Instead, she chose to walk, her hand resting on the cold metalwork of the hearse. She would not leave him, not even for a moment. She was his keeper now, the guardian of his mortal remains, the eternal sentinel of his final, silent journey. The wind howled around them, a mournful dirge for a love that had been as tempestuous and untamed as the Castilian wilderness itself. It had all begun on the 25th of September of that same year, the day the sun had been extinguished forever for Juana. Philip, her beautiful, her adored husband, had died of a sudden fever. The physicians and courtiers spoke of a swift and virulent illness, but she saw only betrayal in their averted eyes. They had let him slip away, or perhaps, they had even helped him along. Her world, a grand cathedral built upon the foundation of his smile and the warmth of his hands, had crumbled into dust in a single, breathless moment. She refused to believe in death, that vulgar and absolute finality. For her, he had merely fallen into a deep slumber, and it was her sacred duty, her entire purpose for being, to remain by his side until the moment of his awakening. The royal bedchamber in Burgos had become a sealed tomb, thick with the scent of myrrh and wilting faith. For 2 days, she had not left his side, refusing all food and drink. She watched the subtle, imagined rise and fall of his chest, her ear pressed against his silent heart, listening for the beat that would signal his return to her. Her ladies-in-waiting wept quietly in the antechamber, their grief a pale imitation of her own vast, silent ocean of despair. The physicians had tried to reason with her, their voices soft and placating. They spoke of the natural order of things, of the need to prepare the king's body for its final rest. She had looked through them, her gaze fixed on Philip's tranquil face. They were fools, spouting empty words. They could not see what she saw, the faint pulse of life still flickering within him, a candle flame she alone could shield from the wind. When they had made a move to touch him, to begin their grim work of embalming, a fury she had not known she possessed had erupted from her. She had thrown herself across his body, a lioness protecting her cub, her voice a low, guttural warning that promised violence. They had recoiled, their faces a mixture of shock and fear. In that moment, she was not their grieving queen, she was a primal force of nature. She had ordered the room cleared, save for a few trusted guards loyal only to her. The great oak doors were barred, the heavy tapestries drawn across the windows, plunging the chamber into a perpetual twilight. Here, in this self-imposed sanctuary, time ceased to exist. There was only the vigil, the unending, hopeful watch over her sleeping king. The world outside could crumble, for all she cared. In the dim light, she would speak to him, her voice a constant, gentle murmur. She recounted their first meeting, the instant, intoxicating spark that had ignited a love so fierce it had consumed them both. She spoke of their children, of the golden hair of their son Charles, the spirited laughter of their daughter Eleanor. He had to return for them. He simply had to. Memories would surface, unbidden and sharp as glass. She remembered him on horseback, his laughter echoing across the plains of Flanders, his fair hair catching the sun like a halo. He was the Archduke of Austria, the Duke of Burgundy, a man born to conquer hearts and kingdoms with equal ease. To think that a simple fever could lay such a man low was an absurdity, a cruel joke played by a malicious god. Then, other memories, darker and more painful, would intrude. The whispers of his infidelities, the sight of him smiling at another woman, a casual glance that had felt like a dagger in her heart. Her jealousy had been a constant, gnawing beast, and now, it transformed into a terrible, possessive grief. He was hers. In life he may have strayed, but in this long sleep, she would keep him entirely for herself. The nobles of Castile grew restless. They sent messages, petitions, emissaries to her door, all of whom were turned away. Her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, was circling like a vulture, she knew. He had always been jealous of Philip, of the power her marriage had brought. He would use her grief, twist it into a narrative of madness to suit his own ambitions. This knowledge hardened her resolve. She would not allow Philip to be buried in the cold, damp soil of Burgos. It was a city that had never truly loved him, a place filled with her father's spies and schemers. He deserved better. He deserved to rest in Granada, the magnificent city they had conquered together, a symbol of their united power and glory. The idea took root, a single, brilliant flower in the barren wasteland of her sorrow. A journey to Granada would be long. It would take weeks, perhaps months. It would be an arduous undertaking, especially in the approaching winter. But it would be time. Time for him to rest, to heal, to awaken. The journey itself would become an act of devotion, a pilgrimage of unwavering faith. The world would see the depth of her love, and Philip, when he awoke, would know its boundless measure. She finally allowed the embalmers access, but only under her strictest supervision. She watched their every move, her eyes burning with suspicion. They were not to disfigure him, not to mar his beauty in any way. She specified the herbs and oils to be used, recalling fragments of ancient rites meant to preserve the body for its journey to the afterlife, or in her case, for its return to the present life. She chose his burial clothes herself, laying out the finest velvet and silk, a doublet of cloth of gold embroidered with the double-headed eagle of the Habsburgs. He would be dressed as the king he was, ready to resume his reign the moment he opened his eyes. This task, this semblance of domestic normalcy, brought her a strange, fleeting comfort. It was as if she were merely helping him dress for a state occasion. The issue of the coffin was her next preoccupation. It had to be perfect, a vessel worthy of carrying her most precious treasure. She commissioned a master artisan to construct it, lined with lead to protect him from the elements and the ravages of time. She insisted on a lock, a strong, intricate mechanism for which she alone would hold the key. No one would disturb his slumber without her express permission. The court whispered that she had lost her mind. They called her Juana la Loca, Juana the Mad. Let them whisper. Their small minds could not comprehend a love like hers, a devotion that transcended the petty boundaries of life and death. She was not mad, she was merely constant. She was the fixed point in a world that had been thrown into chaos, the sole keeper of a sacred and miraculous truth. As the day of their departure neared, a strange sense of calm settled over her. The frantic energy of her initial grief had solidified into a quiet, unshakable purpose. She had a plan, a sacred mission to fulfill. She would escort her husband to Granada, and on the way, surrounded by the loyalty of his Flemish court and the power of her own will, she would see him restored to her. She ate a little, a piece of bread, a sip of wine, enough to sustain the strength she would need for the journey ahead. She allowed her ladies to comb her tangled hair and replace her mourning gown with a fresh one of black velvet. She had to look the part of the queen, the resolute widow whose faith was a beacon in the darkness. Her appearance had to reflect the gravity and solemnity of their royal progress. The night the journey began, the courtyard of the Casa del Corten was a scene of controlled chaos. Torches hissed in the damp air, casting long, dancing shadows. Knights in gleaming armor sat astride their restless chargers. The courtiers, wrapped in heavy, fur-lined cloaks, huddled together, their faces grim and uncertain. It felt less like a funeral procession and more like a phantom army setting out on a nocturnal campaign. When the lead-lined coffin was brought out, a hush fell over the assembly. It was placed carefully onto the ornate, black-draped carriage that would serve as a mobile throne room for a sleeping king. Juana stood apart, watching every detail, her face pale and impassive in the torchlight. She was the director of this strange and somber pageant, the high priestess of a cult of one. She did not enter her own carriage. Instead, she announced her intention to walk beside him, to keep her vigil on the open road. A murmur of protest rippled through the crowd, but one look from her silenced it. She would not be separated from him. Her place was at his side, a constant, living presence to guard his vulnerable, sleeping form. Their journey had now truly begun. The journey commenced months after his passing, a slow-moving wound upon the land. Juana had declared that her husband's body would travel with her to Granada, the hallowed resting place of kings. But this was a pilgrimage with no true destination, a ritual of movement for its own sake. The cortege moved only by the grace of darkness, a river of shadow flowing under the moon. The queen had deemed the sun unworthy to gaze upon her deceased beauty. The star that gave life to the world was, in her eyes, a vulgar voyeur whose harsh light would only serve to mock the perfect stillness of his features. So they slept through its reign, becoming creatures of the day-long dusk, hidden away from its golden, intrusive eye. Their days were spent in the cold embrace of monasteries or the drafty halls of provincial castles. As soon as they arrived, the heavy shutters would be bolted, plunging their temporary homes into an artificial night. The world outside ceased to exist, its vibrant colors and bustling sounds replaced by the hushed whispers of monks and the echoing footsteps of guards. This procession was a spectacle of profound and unsettling devotion. A phantom court on an endless, nocturnal march. The Flemish Guard, Philip's loyal men, formed the honor guard, their grim faces illuminated by the flickering torchlight. Behind them followed the Spanish nobles, their expressions a mixture of weary resignation and barely concealed resentment. And at its heart, the ornate black carriage, a mobile mausoleum drawn by 6 black horses. Juana walked beside it, her hand often resting on the cold wood, as if she could feel his presence through the layers of lead and timber. She had forsaken the comfort of her own carriage, choosing instead this penance, this constant, physical proximity to her silent beloved. When they took refuge, the coffin was always carried to the grandest chamber available, often the chapel or the great hall. It was placed upon a hastily erected catafalque, surrounded by a cordon of guards. And here, Juana's most unyielding rule was enforced: no woman, other than herself, was permitted to approach. Not a nun, not a servant, not the lady of the castle herself. This decree was born of the same jealousy that had tormented her throughout their marriage. Philip, so beautiful, so effortlessly charming, had been a magnet for the admiring glances of women. In her grief-stricken mind, his allure had not diminished in death. He was merely sleeping, vulnerable to the seductive wiles of any who might come near. She would be his sole guardian against such spectral temptations. She remembered the countless court functions, the burning humiliation of watching him dance with another, his laughter a melody that was not meant for her ears. She had thrown scenes, her accusations echoing through palaces, only to be met with his charming dismissals or cold anger. Her love was a possessive fire, and death had not quenched its flames, it had merely refined them into this sharp, paranoid vigilance. Now, at last, she was in complete control. She alone dictated who could enter his presence. Her ladies-in-waiting, once her confidants, were now relegated to the outer chambers, their movements watched with suspicion. They learned to avert their eyes from the coffin as if it were a holy relic too powerful for their gaze, their existence a fearful orbit around the dark star of their queen's obsession. One evening, in a remote castle, the lord's young daughter, driven by a morbid curiosity, crept into the hall where the coffin lay. She was a child of perhaps 14, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. She took a few tentative steps forward, drawn to the spectacle of the royal bier, wanting only a glimpse of the legendary dead prince. Juana, who had been sitting in silent vigil in a high-backed chair, did not rise. She did not scream or issue a command. She simply turned her head, and her dark, hollowed eyes fixed upon the girl. The look was not one of anger, but of something far more terrifying, a profound and absolute negation. In that gaze, the girl was not a person, but an insect to be brushed aside. The child froze, all color draining from her face. Before she could retreat, 2 guards stepped forward, their movements swift and silent. They took her by the arms and escorted her from the hall without a word. The lesson was stark and immediate, rippling through the entire household. The queen's sanctuary was inviolable. Her sleeping husband was hers and hers alone. Each day, as the world outside slept, her private ritual would unfold. She would dismiss the guards, leaving only herself in the vast, silent room. From a chain around her neck, she would produce a heavy iron key. The sound of it turning in the intricate lock of the coffin was the only sound that mattered, a metallic heartbeat in the profound stillness. She would raise the heavy lid herself, refusing all assistance. Her muscles, though slight, were wiry with the strength of her singular purpose. And then she would look upon his face. In the cool, embalmed perfection of his features, she saw not death, but a deep and lasting peace. The waxen pallor of his skin was, to her, the tranquility of a man in profound slumber. For a moment, hope would surge, a painful, familiar tide. She would hold her breath, waiting for the flicker of an eyelid, the faintest sigh from his lips. The disappointment, when it came, was just as sharp as it had been the first time, yet she bore it with the stoicism of a true believer. His awakening would come, but in its own time. Her faith must not waver. She would speak to him then, her voice a soft murmur that the stone walls absorbed like a secret. She told him of the journey, of the foolishness of the courtiers, of the stars she had seen the night before. She would comb his fine, fair hair with an ivory comb, her touch gentle, reverent. She adjusted the velvet of his tunic, ensuring he remained comfortable in his long rest. These moments were the justification for everything. Here, in this macabre intimacy, he was entirely hers. There were no rivals, no affairs of state to draw his attention away. He could not turn from her, could not dismiss her with a careless word. His silence was a canvas upon which she could paint the perfect, attentive husband she had always craved. The members of her court were living ghosts, trapped in her waking nightmare. They rode through the night, half-frozen and exhausted, and spent their days in shuttered gloom. Their own lives, their families, their duties, were all held in abeyance, subject to the whims of a queen who conversed with a corpse. Resentment festered in the shadows, spoken in hushed tones in cloistered courtyards. They spoke of sending secret letters to her father, the powerful King Ferdinand of Aragon, imploring him to intervene. But fear held them in check. Juana's grief had given her an aura of unassailable, almost divine, authority. To defy her felt like sacrilege. And her Flemish guards, fiercely loyal to the memory of their dead master, watched the Spanish nobles with open distrust. So the procession crawled across the bleak Castilian landscape, a movable feast of sorrow. They became a legend whispered in the villages they passed, a cautionary tale told by mothers to frighten their children. The mad queen who traveled with her dead husband, who commanded the sun to hide its face and forbade women from her sight. Juana was oblivious to the legend she was creating. Her entire consciousness was focused on the task at hand. The rhythmic creak of the carriage wheels was the music of her life. The cold night air was the only air she wished to breathe. This journey was not a means to an end, it was the end itself. It was a state of being, a perfect, hermetically sealed world inhabited only by her and her sleeping king. Granada remained a distant, almost mythical destination. She was in no hurry to reach it, for to arrive would mean the end of the journey. It would mean consigning him to the earth, an act of finality she was not yet, and might never be, prepared to face. As long as they were moving, as long as they were on this road, Philip was not truly buried. He was merely traveling with her, forever by her side. The years bled into one another, forming a single, endless, twilit road. Autumn withered into winter, and the snows of the Castilian plateau melted under a spring sun that the procession never saw. Seasons turned, harvests were gathered, children were born and grew, but the funeral cortege continued its aimless, nocturnal pilgrimage through the heart of Spain. The journey to Granada had become the journey itself. The ritual of the night remained immutable, a dark sacrament that held their world together. In the chill of a monastery chapel or the cavernous hall of some forgotten castle, Juana would give the order. The groaning of the heavy lid being lifted was the evening's first prayer. The thick, sweet scent of decay, now barely masked by incense and herbs, would fill the air, a perfume of devotion only she could tolerate. She would sit beside him, her vigil now a conversation with what remained. The handsome prince was gone, his beauty a feast for worms. The flesh had surrendered its form, pulling back from the elegant structure of his bones. But for Juana, this was merely a stage in his long slumber. A trial to test her faith. She looked upon the ruin of his face and saw only her beloved, resting. Her monologues had changed over the slow-turning years. She no longer spoke of their children with the same hopeful urgency. Instead, she whispered of betrayals, real and imagined. She recounted the sideways glances of the courtiers, the insolent tone of a guard, the latest letter from her father, full of false concern that was a thin veil for his avarice for her throne. Philip was her only true confidant, the silent, perfect listener who never judged, never interrupted. She would lean close, her lips near the place where his ear had been, and unburden her soul of the day's poisons. The world was a web of conspiracy woven to separate them, to steal her power, to declare her mad. But they would not succeed, she vowed to him nightly. She would reach out and touch him. Her fingers, once tracing the firm line of his jaw, now brushed away the dust of his own decay from a bare cheekbone. She saw no horror in this. It was an act of profound intimacy, the duty of a wife tending to her ailing husband. She was his nurse, his guardian, his shield against the slow indignities of this terrible, unending sickness. There were nights when her sorrow would overwhelm her. A great, silent wave would rise up and she would lay her head upon the edge of the coffin, her body racked with sobs that made no sound. The tears she had refused to shed in the first weeks of her grief now flowed freely in the secret dark. They were tears not for his death, but for his suffering, for this long and cruel sleep. And then, she would kiss him. She would press her lips to the crumbling ruin of his mouth, a gesture that horrified all who witnessed it. For the courtiers, forced to stand sentinel at the far end of the hall, this was the nightly apex of their queen's madness. It was a desecration, a grotesque parody of love that turned their stomachs and chilled their souls to the marrow. They were prisoners in this moving necropolis. Their own lives had ceased to have meaning, subsumed by her singular, all-consuming delusion. They were actors in her private play, their lines unspoken, their movements dictated by the inexorable creep of her grief. They aged, their faces growing gaunt and weary, their eyes reflecting the endless, torchlit darkness of their existence. The physical toll of the journey was immense, but the psychological rot was worse. They were complicit in this madness, their presence lending it a veneer of royal legitimacy. They were the silent enablers of her necrotic fantasy. To leave would be treason. To stay was to lose oneself, to have one's own sanity slowly eroded by the constant, cloying presence of death. One night, a young Flemish knight, new to the honor guard and not yet inured to the horror, fainted. He had stood his post stoically, but the moment the queen leaned in for her nightly kiss, he had crumpled to the stone floor in a heap of clattering armor. The sound echoed in the cavernous silence, a sharp intrusion of reality into Juana's sacred space. Juana did not even turn her head. She finished her tender ministration, whispering a final good night to Philip's remains. Only then did she rise and look down at the unconscious knight. Her expression was not one of concern, but of cold, remote annoyance. He had disturbed the peace. He had broken the sanctity of her communion with her husband. She simply pointed a finger toward the crumpled form. Two older guards, their faces impassive masks, moved forward and dragged the young man from the hall. He was dismissed from her service the next day, banished from her presence. The message was clear, there was no room for weakness here. There was no room for any reality but the one she had constructed. She adjusted the fine silk shroud, tucking it carefully around his skeletal shoulders. She imagined it was a blanket she was drawing up to his chin to ward off the chill of the night. Her mind had become a powerful alchemist, transmuting the base metal of horror into the pure gold of devotion. The evidence of her senses was meaningless against the unshakable conviction of her heart. The kingdom of Castile, leaderless and adrift, was a mirror of its queen. Her father, Ferdinand, ruled as regent, his grip tightening with each passing year. He used reports of her bizarre pilgrimage to solidify his position, painting her as tragically, hopelessly insane. A queen who kissed a corpse could not be trusted with a crown. Her love had become his greatest political weapon. But Juana was insulated from the machinations of the world. Her kingdom was the size of a coffin. Her subjects were the weary ghosts who followed her through the night. Her only politics were the politics of memory and desire, her only statecraft the careful preservation of a dead man's bones. She had abdicated one throne for another, and this one she would never relinquish. The seasons continued their relentless cycle beyond the shuttered windows of their daily refuge. Snow fell, blanketing a silent world in white. Wildflowers bloomed in unseen meadows. The sun beat down on dusty roads they would only travel in darkness. Time, for the rest of the world, was a river flowing forward. For Juana and her court, it was a stagnant, brackish pool. Her delusion was now complete, a fortress of the mind with walls so high no truth could breach them. Philip was not dead. He was enchanted, the victim of a terrible curse that only her unwavering love could break. This journey was the quest to find the cure. Every sunrise they avoided, every woman they turned away, was a small victory against the dark magic that held him. This belief was the engine that drove her, the thing that allowed her to look upon his mortal remains without flinching. She was not a madwoman consorting with a corpse. She was the heroine of a great and tragic romance, the only one who knew the truth, the only one with the strength to see it through. Her necrotic delirium had become her singular, defining reality, and she had plunged an entire kingdom into it with her. One day, after nearly 3 years of wandering, the procession's path was blocked. It was her father, King Ferdinand. He did not come with an army to intimidate, but with a small, resolute retinue that stood like a wall of iron across the moonlit road. He did not rush forward to argue or entreat. He simply stood before her, and in his gaze, there was no pity, only steel. The two groups faced each other in the darkness, their torches creating a nervous, flickering island of light in the vast emptiness of the plain. For a long moment, the only sounds were the stamping of horses and the whisper of the wind through the dry grass. Juana's courtiers shifted uneasily, a palpable wave of fear and anticipation passing through their ranks. The endless ritual had been broken. Ferdinand dismounted, his movements measured and deliberate. He walked toward his daughter, not as a father to a grieving child, but as one monarch to another. He stopped a few paces from where she stood, her hand resting protectively on the carriage that held her world. He did not glance at the coffin. His focus was entirely, and unnervingly, on her. He did not speak of her madness. He did not mention her macabre nightly rituals or the whispers that followed her across the kingdom. To do so would be to engage her on her own terms, in the realm of grief and obsession. Instead, he spoke of duty. Of the crown. Of the country that was bleeding in the absence of its queen. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the night with absolute clarity. His words were sharp, pragmatic stones, chipping away at the foundation of her self-contained world. He spoke of the plotting of nobles, of the unrest in the cities, of the alliances that were fraying at the edges. He spoke of Castile, not as a land to be mourned over, but as a living entity that required a firm hand, a present and visible sovereign. And then he spoke of her son, Charles. The name fell into the silence between them with immense weight. He was the rightful heir, Ferdinand reminded her, the future of their combined kingdoms. He needed a kingdom to inherit, not a traveling mausoleum. He needed a mother to secure his legacy, not a high priestess for a cult of the dead. Juana listened, her face a pale, impassive mask. Inside, a cold fury was building. This was her father's true nature. The cunning politician, the wolf who had always circled Philip, jealous of his youth, his power, his place in her heart. He was using her own son, his own grandson, as a weapon against her. He was dressing his ambition in the noble robes of fatherly concern and royal duty. She tried to dismiss him with a gesture, a flick of her wrist that had silenced bishops and lords for 3 years. She commanded her procession to move forward, her voice low and tight with a command that had never been disobeyed. But this time, nothing happened. Her Flemish guards looked uncertainly from her to the implacable figures blocking the road. Her own spell was broken. Ferdinand had not taken her body by force, he was taking her purpose. He was methodically dismantling the logic of her world. Her journey, which she had framed as an act of ultimate devotion, he was reframing as the ultimate act of selfish negligence. Her vigil for her husband was, in his telling, a betrayal of her son. The righteousness of her quest began to feel like a shroud of ashes. He took another step closer. "He is gone, Juana," he said, and for the first time, his voice held a trace of something other than steel, perhaps a sliver of weary truth. "Your husband is gone. But your son lives. Your kingdom lives. Your duty is to the living. Let the dead find their rest, so that the living may find their way." It was the cruelest blow he could have landed. He was not ordering her, he was redefining her. He proposed a new path. Philip would be interred, he said, not in distant Granada, but nearby, in the convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas. There, he would have a magnificent tomb. And she could remain there with him. Her vigil could continue, but it would be stationary. Contained. Her grief would be given a home, but it would also be given walls. It was a brilliant, terrible trap. He was not separating her from Philip. He was offering her an eternity by his side, but an eternity of stillness. He was ending the journey, the one thing that gave her days meaning, the one thing that kept the finality of the grave at bay. As long as they were moving, Philip was not buried. To stop was to admit defeat. To stop was to bury him. She looked from her father's implacable face to the faces of her own courtiers. She saw in their eyes not just fear, but a flicker of hope. They were weary. They longed for an end to this nightmare. In that moment, she realized she was truly alone. Her phantom court was ready to desert her. Her will, which had held them all in thrall for so long, was beginning to fail. The choice he gave her was no choice at all. To continue her journey now would be an open act of rebellion against the regent, an act that would endanger her son's inheritance. To accept his offer was to surrender, to concede that her grand pilgrimage had been a folly. He had cornered her, using her own love and her own royal blood as the bars of her cage. For a long time, she said nothing. The wind whipped a strand of her dark hair across her face. The torches spat and hissed. The world held its breath. She looked one last time at the long, dark road stretching out behind them, the path of her years of devotion. And then she looked at the road ahead, blocked by her father, the end of the line. There was nowhere left to go. A single, almost imperceptible nod was her only answer. It was enough. A collective sigh of relief, quickly suppressed, went through the assembled nobles. Ferdinand's expression did not change. He had won. He had not crushed her, but he had successfully diverted the powerful, destructive river of her grief into a channel of his own making. He did not gloat. He simply gave the quiet orders. The procession was to turn, to make for towards Elas. The journey was over. As the great carriage began its slow, ponderous turn, a change occurred in Juana. The fire in her eyes, the iron in her spine, seemed to dissolve. All that was left was a profound and hollow emptiness. Her purpose had been exorcised, and its absence was a cold, new form of death. She was interred in the castle of towards Elas. It was a palace, not a prison, but the distinction was academic. The walls were hung with priceless tapestries and the windows offered sweeping views of the river Duera, but for her, they were the bars of a gilded cage. A cage built by her father's political pragmatism and cemented by her own unwavering love. The coffin, containing all that was left of Philip, was placed in the nearby convent of Santa Clara. It was close enough to be a constant presence, a focal point for her existence. From the window of her chambers, she could see the stone walls of the monastery, a silent, unmoving testament to the men who rested within. The journey was over. The stillness had begun. For almost 46 years, she lived within those walls. The world outside moved on. Her father died. Her son Charles, once a boy she barely knew, became a powerful Holy Roman Emperor, his armies marching across Europe. Kings and popes changed, wars were fought and won, new worlds were discovered. But in towards Elas, time stood still. She was never permitted to see his body again. The iron key that had been her most precious possession was gone, her nightly ritual forbidden. The physical connection was severed, the tangible proof of his presence removed. They thought this would cure her, that removing the object of her obsession would force her back to reality. They were wrong. Deprived of the physical, her devotion became purely metaphysical. It moved from her hands to her soul, becoming a more potent, more unshakable force. She no longer needed to see his decay to know he was with her. Her faith was absolute, requiring no evidence. He had simply transitioned from a sleeping body to a watchful spirit. Her days fell into a rhythm as unchanging as the seasons. She would rise, she would pray, she would spend hours at her window, her gaze fixed upon the monastery. She watched the sun rise and cast long shadows from its walls, she watched the evening light turn the stones to gold. She was a sentinel, her vigil now one of distance and longing. But it was at night that her new ritual, the one that would define the rest of her long life, truly began. As the servants came to prepare her evening meal, she would issue the same, quiet command, a command they learned never to question. 2 place settings. Always 2. One for her, and one for the king. So they would set the great table in her chambers. The finest china, the heaviest silver, 2 crystal goblets that shone in the candlelight. A chair was placed for her at one end, and directly opposite, a high-backed, empty chair for her husband, her guest, her eternal companion. The servants would work in silence, their movements filled with a reverent fear. When the meal was served, they would withdraw, closing the heavy doors behind them. And Juana would dine. She ate little, just enough to sustain her life, her body a frail vessel for her immense and unending love. She would eat in the profound silence, her eyes fixed on the empty chair opposite her. But for her, it was not empty. There, she saw him. Not the decaying corpse from the coffin, but Philip as he was in his prime. His fair hair catching the light of the candles, his blue eyes filled with the familiar, reckless amusement. He was dressed in fine velvet, a faint smile playing on his lips. He had returned to her, as she always knew he would. She would speak to him in a low murmur, the one-sided conversation that was the soundtrack of her life. She told him of her day, of the changing light on the monastery walls, of the insolence of a new serving girl, of the distant, meaningless news of her son's latest victory. She complained of her loneliness, a loneliness he alone could understand. In her mind, he would answer. His voice, which she had not heard in decades, was perfectly clear. He would soothe her, tease her, advise her. He was the perfect husband now, attentive and faithful. He never left her side. His infidelities, his neglect, his tempers, all the painful realities of their life together, were washed away, purified in the crucible of her memory. The years passed. Her hair, once the color of midnight, turned to silver and then to snow. The smooth skin of her face became a delicate map of wrinkles. Her movements grew slower, her body more frail. But in her nightly communion, she remained the young, passionate girl who had fallen in love at first sight, and he remained the beautiful Archduke, forever 28. The servants who tended to her aged and died, replaced by their children and then their grandchildren. They inherited the duty of setting the king's place at the queen's table. The story of the Mad Queen became a whispered legend, and they were the living custodians of her myth. They protected her, feared her, and, in a way, they believed with her. She became a ghost in her own lifetime, a forgotten queen locked away with her memories. The powerful empire her son ruled was a distant rumor. The world was a place she no longer belonged to. Her only reality was contained within the stone walls of her chambers, in the flickering candlelight of her nightly dinners for two. She lived to be 75 years old. On her final evening, she was too weak to move to the table. She lay in her bed, her breath shallow, her eyes fixed on the window. The setting sun was casting its last golden rays on the walls of the Santa Clara convent. Her vigil was almost over. She gave her last order, her voice a faint whisper. "Tell the king," she said to her weeping lady-in-waiting, "that I will be with him shortly. He should not wait dinner for me." Her gaze remained on the monastery, on the place where he had waited for her for so long. Her love had been her madness, her prison, and her salvation. It had cost her a kingdom, her freedom, and her connection to the living world. But in the end, it had given her what she craved above all else, an eternity with Philip. As she closed her eyes for the last time, she did not step into the darkness of death, but into the warm, welcoming light of his long-awaited embrace.